Terminus Ensemble, I co-founded 3 years ago with Brent Milam and Sarah Hirsch, and 2 other local composers. And our mission is to promote music by local composers. So we're starting our 4th season next week, and we'll be playing pieces by Lawrence Scher, who teaches at Kennesaw State, Nick Demas, who teaches at Georgia State, Connor Way, who just graduated from Georgia State, Jason Freeman from Georgia Tech, a piece by Nicole Chamberlain, who is also our flute player, a piece by me, and I'm missing one, a piece by Zach Browning, who is originally from Georgia but now lives in Illinois. Some of these pieces we've played before. We have decided that we want to be a group that plays pieces the composers have heard before, so we're not necessarily looking for premieres. We're not opposed to premieres, but we're trying to just help get more music out there, and that's also why we're focusing on local composers. We recently did a call for scores for composers from the surrounding states of Georgia, so we're going to have a more regional focus. Our next concert is going to be October 17th at the Florence Coppliff Recital Hall at Georgia State, and it's a free concert. It starts at 8 o'clock. Concert's free because we want to encourage as many people to come out as possible. We are trying to grow interest in contemporary music in general, but also the art of people in Atlanta. We have not settled on a date for our spring concert yet, but it'll probably be sometime in April. We've sort of settled on a kind of late October or November and April, maybe early May time frame for our concerts. Terminus, it's gone back and forth. We've had around 50 sometimes, and then more like 15 or 20 sometimes, depending. There was one performance where it was storming and Obama was in town, and so that one was really lightly attended. And we're trying to get better about advertising and hosting in more places so more people know about it, because we have found people said, "Oh, I didn't even know it was happening." It's even as much as you do, it's still never quite enough to let everyone know it's happening. So far, we have solicited pieces from people that we knew and we liked their music and wanted to see what would fit with our instrumentation. And oftentimes, the actual selections from whatever they gave us came down to practical reasons of one player could only commit to doing a certain number of pieces. So we said, okay, let's do this trio and this duo and this quartet. For our next concert, where we have our call for scores for regional composers, we got, every composer was allowed to submit 2 pieces, so we had 56 composers, most of whom submitted 2, so almost 100 pieces there. Brent and Sarah and I sat down at Brent's house 3 weeks in a row and just listened to a lot of music and kind of said, yes, let's pass this on to the next round or not. And now we're each individually listening a little more thoroughly to the 30 that we whittled it down to try to figure out what are the pieces we're going to program and what are some we might save for another day. We asked them to send a score and a recording if available. Even MIDI was okay, even up. Obviously, no one prefers to listen to MIDI mock-ups, but if that's all they have, then that's okay. We wanted to kind of see what all was out there, because we found a lot of great composers we had not heard of. I know a lot of people in the region, but there were these, oh, that piece was great. Where does she live? No, we specified in the call for scores that we will select a few pieces and play them in the spring. We may reserve some for future performances. We would love it if they could come, but we're a shoestring operation, and so we'll put on a concert. If they can come down from Charlotte or Birmingham or wherever, then that's great. I mean, as a composer, I'm sending out music to these kind of calls all the time, and it's always just you send your best piece and hope that they like it. And I'm sure every group was inundated like we were, and we even narrowed it down to a few states. Some people have national or international calls, and it can get overwhelming. It was a lot for us to sit down. We had to be really ruthless, frankly, and say, like, nope, didn't grab me. Let's look a little further. Yeah, it looks like it's about the same. Next. Generally started looking at the score, not looking for style at all, just looking for, does this look competent? And if we saw some really egregious mistakes, we would immediately be skeptical. But we would still listen to a little bit of everything. And then sometimes some of those pieces, well, it actually sounded pretty cool. We would pass it on to the next round. But usually it went hand in hand that if the score looked really professional, then the piece was really good. Well, that's so we can spread the duties for one, but part of the history of it was Brent and I did our masters together at Georgia State, and we had wanted to work on some kind of project for years, but I lived in Ireland and New York, and then when I moved down to Florida, I thought, well, I'm 5 hours away. It's close enough that we could do something, at least if it's only twice a year like we've been doing. And I met Sarah. She had just finished her master's at Florida, but she hung around for my first year because her husband was finishing his law degree, and he got a job up here and she got a job up here, and so we were just kind of talking, and I said, well, I want to try to get you hooked into the new music scene. And then just through all three of our conversations kind of said, well, maybe we should start a new ensemble that does local music. That's not really been done. And I had a lot of other performer friends, many from Georgia State, or we knew each other through other people, and found the sort of standard Pierrot ensemble instrumentation, and everyone was interested in playing, so we started planning things. Well, I'm originally from Atlanta, one of the proud few natives, and I went to Georgia State University and did my bachelor's in music technology, and then I went back and did a master's in music composition. Following that, I did a master in sonic arts at Queen's University Belfast in Northern Ireland. Then I had 2 years of being a starving artist in New York City before I began my PhD at the University of Florida, which I just completed this spring. My PhD was in music composition, and I did a cognate area in media studies. Well, a course in composition is usually private lessons with a senior composer. So generally today you'll bring in your music and the composer will comment on what could be improved, what music maybe you should listen to that your music resembles that might help you figure out how to do things. But composition courses also, sometimes they are more of a seminar where there might be a topic on a certain aspect of history, experimentalism, or I took one on postmodernism, for example, thinking about the idea of pastiche in music and doing some pieces using existing material, which is not something I usually do. So sometimes there are actual courses to stretch you a little bit. Well, one piece I did for that course did use sampling. I think I used about 30 different pieces, which some were classical, some were pop, some were jazz. I was trying to make it as eclectic as possible, but I also looked at what keys the pieces were in and tried to structure it in sort of a sonata form. So it kind of starts in D minor and then moves to kind of A and some other areas before moving back to D major with the pieces that I used there. At Georgia State, I primarily studied with Robert Scott Thompson. I also worked a little bit with Nick Demas, and on the side I've studied a little bit with John Anthony Lennon, who teaches at Emory. At Queen's University Belfast, my advisor was Pedro Rebello, and at the University of Florida, I worked with all three faculty. James Paul Sane was my advisor, Paul Kuntz was also on my dissertation committee, and I also studied with Paul Richards. My dissertation was partially a theoretical document and partially a composition. So the composition was a piece called Keys for piano and percussion and electronics, and both players also doubled on other instruments like toy piano and typewriter. So anything I could think of that used keys went into that piece. The theoretical document is called Buy, Build, Break, Composers and Objects, and this is looking specifically at practices in experimental music that are centered around a particular object. So the idea that you want to write a piece about toy piano, or maybe you want to write a piece where you need to build an instrument first before you can make that piece, and then the breaking part is an idea of modifying an existing instrument. For instance, I'm interested in circuit bending, which you take an existing toy, an electronic toy, and short circuit it on purpose to make interesting glitches and change the pitch and things like that. So that's another practice in experimental music. So I'm trying to see how objects influence how we make music. So one of these circuit bend instruments is a speak and read. So this came from the Speak and Spell line by Texas Instruments in the 1980s. These have great electronic voice synthesis, and older toys like those have a lot of exposed circuits inside. Newer toys are all based on microcomputers, so there's not as much as you can do. But these old toys from the 80s, you have a lot of different points you can put together that will do something very unexpected. And there's been a lot of documentation. These are very popular toys to use, so you know that you can put these points together and add a resistor and drop the pitch, for example. So they give you a lot more flexibility to perform with. So I do a lot of free improvisation and things like that, and it's fun to play with a toy like that. I've had some other toys that I've jimmied that maybe I can make do 2 different things. So they might be fun if I have 10 different toys around, but they're not as effective as an instrument in themselves. For me, I often think about the instruments I'm going to use. And this goes along the lines with my dissertation research, actually. I'm very interested in showing the inner life of an object. So an object could be a particular ensemble, or it could be a particular instrument. So I think about what those instruments do well, what interesting techniques they might do, and I usually try to pick 2 or 3 of those to focus on. So it might be the harmonic series, or whatever its lowest note is, or a certain way of producing harmonics or something like that, and then I try to center a piece around that. And then it kind of grows organically. Sometimes I will make a structure ahead of time, sometimes I will use random number generators to figure out where things will happen and then hone it from there. So each piece sort of works differently. I put them together differently anyway. I am actually right now working on my first ever orchestra piece. So yes, I do that sometimes. And while I have talked about these weird electronic instruments, yes, on the next Terminus concert we're doing a quintet, which is flute, clarinet, violin, cello, and piano that I just finished this summer. So yes, I do write for traditional instruments as well. I do use chance to figure out things while I'm making a piece, and I have written some very free pieces at some points, but it's hard to say. I think there's kind of a continuum of chance, and so you might do something like me where you use it a little bit to get you started, or sometimes you might use it to make a whole piece. I'm interested in both, but I'm usually more on that end of the scale of use it some but not exclusively. Every piece has some indeterminacy for it, and Cage wrote about that in Silence. He said even Art of Fugue by Bach, it doesn't specify any instrument or any dynamics, so there's actually a lot of indeterminacy in it. And I think that that's beautiful. That's why I leave a lot for performers to interpret. I like to have a little dialogue with them as we rehearse a piece to see, oh, maybe it would be better this way than I originally thought. A lot of times it is. Yes, this piece is scored in a traditional way. They'll play the same pitches each time, but the tempo and dynamics and all that might vary a little bit. And I think that's interesting because it gives it a little more life. I played piano for a long time. I feel very rusty right now, but I'm actually playing Workers Union with Chamber Cartel at the end of the month, playing keyboards. Play a lot of found objects and these toys that we talked about as well. I used to play trombone as also. Maybe I've morphed to these weird instruments because no one knows what it's like to be an expert on those, and so I can become an expert on that with different criteria than with playing piano. That's great. I like teaching also very much, and just having the freedom to do experimental music. I don't really want to go into commercial music. Working for Turner or something like that might be fun, but I don't think it's really me where I'm at. So yeah, I would like to stay that route, but I'm also interested in arts administration, such as what I'm doing with Terminus. So that's another avenue I might be exploring as well. I was just never that interested in film scoring, and a lot of people are, and so it's great if you want to do that. I know that I'm just more of like a kind of experimentalist scholar type, so academia seems a better fit for me. But like I mentioned, arts administration is also attractive because I'm running this ensemble. I'm also production manager at the Charlotte New Music Festival in North Carolina. So the Charlotte New Music Festival is a 2-week festival up in Charlotte, North Carolina. It takes place the second half of June every year. It's a chance for student composers mainly to come together, share their work with each other, and have lessons and seminars with guest composers, and get a piece played by a professional ensemble. So last year we brought down Ictus Percussion and Load Bang from New York City. This year we're going to be bringing in Great Noise Ensemble from Washington, D.C., as well as Freya String Quartet from Pittsburgh, and Load Bang is coming back again. So every student composer will be commissioned to write a piece for one of those ensembles, rehearse it with the ensembles and hear it at the festival, as well as getting some lessons and seminars. Yeah, minimalism is something I was into and then didn't listen to much of for a while, and now I've come back to it, and I would consider my music somewhat minimalist, but in a different way from the big four. It's not really based on pulses, but I'm more interested in having keeping the static harmonies, but maybe not having the regular pulsation. So more of the idea of not much happens. More of the idea of what visual minimal art is like, of this piece is about a thing, instead of this piece is about this cell that slowly changes to something else. A lot of people do find emotion in his music, for example, and especially John Adams, since he's gone more the neo-romantic route. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the early minimalism, it is very strict and abstract, so I can understand, and since some of it's 4 hours long, I can understand how some people would say, well, I have to sit through that. I don't get it after the first minute, therefore it's unemotional. People just have these sort of reactions and need to label it as something. So it's cold or intellectual or something is their label for it now. Yeah. Well, I like what you were saying about with minimalism, you can sort of drift away from it and come back, and then you might notice, oh, that is a little different than it was before. So I try to do that some with my music too. I want to sort of create an environment where you can sit there and ponder these ideas with me, but if you're not following note to note, then that can be okay. But I'm influenced by ambient music like Brian Eno as well, and the whole idea behind that is it can be in the background, or you can listen to it intently, and either way is fine. It should be as ignorable as it is interesting, is what he said. He also says he wants to make it interesting. If you do want to pay attention to it, it should also be interesting. So it's not just one drone playing the whole time. There are repeated patterns and things like that too. It just might take longer time to develop than a piece of dance music. Well, I listen to that kind of thing a lot when I'm working. Even sometimes when I'm composing, just because I want to have something happening in the background, so I could, not when I'm trying to figure out ideas, but if I'm sort of copying over passages and I need to do that for 2 hours, I like to put on some kind of ambient recording. Recently, I've been really interested in Taylor Dupree, who runs this label called 12K. And his music, it can be a little noisier sometimes. So he has some very pretty elements, but also some kind of static and drone type of things. There's also an associated label called Line, which is run by Richard Chartier, and he does very minimal, like sometimes there's long stretches of silence and just these little pops will come in. So I like that too. Wouldn't want to make a steady diet of any particular kind of music, but yeah, if I want to have the sort of intellectual challenge and really be in the music, then I would listen to something very modernist. But for times when I'm working, then yeah, I might want to have some ambient music just so I can kind of listen to it for a little bit, come back to what I'm doing. Oh, my take is very much it's there by association. We are conditioned through film and all this that certain sounds sound like terror or love or whatever. Yeah, I write very abstract music, and if people think it sounds sad, I'm okay with that, but I didn't go into it thinking I'm going to write a sad piece. I mean, I think it's still like Suspensions, for example, they always kind of sound a little wistful or sad, but we did find at some point that that was effective for making people feel that. So maybe there's something inherent there, but it seems like now at the stage we're in, we know how to capture those effects by doing these particular effects. So it seems to come back to that association idea that you want to write a sad piece, well, put it in a minor key and have a lot of suspensions. Yeah, I mean, I think about like a lot of more modal music, like Eastern European or Jewish music. Like a lot of it is sort of minor key, but it's played at parties and it can sound happy. So I think the untrained people would say, well, that was a peppy song, so it must be major. Well, technically, no, because there's so many other elements than just pitches. Tempo, texture, timbre, all of that feeds into it. So if you have an acoustic guitar arpeggiating slowly, then that can sound fairly plaintive no matter the key. And if you have a really heavily distorted guitar, that's probably going to sound angry to most people. Even something, one example I like to play to my students was My Bloody Valentine, which is an early 90s band, and they had very distorted guitars, but it ends up sounding kind of beautiful because it's just these big washes of sound, and I always kind of feel like it's just like a nice blanket of sound, even though it's heavily distorted tones. So again, it's all in the association culturally and within the music itself. So you can have these slow tempo major key things and they might sound somber, or fast minor keys and they might sound happy and peppy. Well, I mean, I've actually thought about it a lot because I think a lot of my music will probably come off as sad, but and maybe that's like a back of my mind thing coming out, but I really am trying to focus on the instruments and what can be more kind of concrete and abstract than this piece is about horn and vibraphone. But I will give titles to give some kind of metaphor to think about that might allude to something. Like the piece I just mentioned for horn and vibraphone is called Charman, which is a Gaelic word that means sanctuary. So someone might hear that and think, oh, this is sort of like a peaceful, meditative type of piece. And yeah, I did go for that vibe, but I'm not trying to make you feel, solemn. My personal feeling on music is the emotions are associative. I don't see why we can't associate emotions with new music, and I think a lot of contemporary composers are probably still thinking in that kind of romantic, I want to convey an emotion way. I might not be myself. So I think it just comes down to kind of unfamiliarity with techniques, and you really do have to take every piece on its own terms. People aren't used to that. They like that Mozart's so predictable, like you were talking about. They like that they know that I can kind of, even if they're not literally counting, they can feel the beats until a cadence happens or until a section ends. And contemporary music subverts that almost all the time. And so maybe since it's so weird, that means it's cerebral and unemotional to people because they have to think about it. But you can also just let some of it wash over you and kind of intuitively feel it.